Greetings and welcome to LA Quill. Today we're diving into chapter 30 of Arianna's tale. Damuk's mind was dwelling on his betrothed. 3 ships were prepared for departure, and they were leaving the port of Aralor immediately. He wished there was a way to deal with the muradeen without leaving his home for an extended period of time. He resolved to return within 3 months, regardless of their success. He would not miss the birth of his first child, and he also wanted some time with Arianna before the birth. He rubbed his eyes, watching the last of the men board the ships. He was exhausted, and he was very close to not being able to keep his fatigue from his men. 3 days in the saddle would do that. It was something he was going to have to remedy before they reached the muradeen. It was never a good idea to engage in any type of magic when tired, and magic would certainly be a necessary component to their success. A gravelly voice interrupted his thoughts. "My lord," Captain Perrin asked. "My lord, we'd be ready to sail. Tide's right now." Damuk nodded, heading toward the gangplank slowly. This was one of those times when he wished he didn't have such a strict sense of duty. If he didn't, he'd stay with his beloved and let someone else handle the creature. Boarding the ship, he sighed heavily. Arianna looked up at the sky as she harvested her mint. She was lonely. It had been almost 2 weeks since Damuk's departure, and she missed him more with each passing day. She was just under halfway through her pregnancy, and she wished he was here with her to experience it. She wished he would come home. Just yesterday, she'd felt the baby move for the first time. At least it was the first time she was sure it was the baby. She cried when she realized that there was no one to share this with. Faylene didn't count. She thought back to the last 2 weeks. She'd been treated with a great deal of respect and consideration following the engagement announcement from everyone, including the nobility. Though their courtesy seemed rather forced. She'd asked Rockin about it, and he'd explained that they didn't like some little peasant slave becoming not only their equal, but their superior. It would take them time to adjust. That made her think, and she'd asked why the guards didn't seem to resent her. The Emperor had explained that as heir to the throne, Damuk was the primary commander of the military, and they had an enormous amount of respect for him, and trusted him implicitly. They knew that if he chose to make her his bride, there was a very good reason for it, even if they didn't know what that reason was. Then Rockin had laughed and said that in Myron's case there was another reason. It was unlikely that she'd run as Damuk's wife, and Myron was tired of chasing her. Arianna had smiled at that, realizing that he had been teasing her. But his words had answered another question she'd had. The guards saluted Damuk, but bowed to every noble they came across, including her and Rockin. It was because Damuk was their commander-in-chief. She placed a hand on her belly protectively, thinking that one day her son would hold the same position. The idea made her smile. Arianna rose, picking up her now-filled basket of mint. From the corner of her eye, she saw Myron detach himself from the wall he'd been casually leaning against. He was like her shadow, never letting her get far from his sight. When she slept, he had guards placed outside her bedchamber, both in the outer chamber and on the veranda. With Cybil and Icon still out there somewhere, she understood the precautions. But still, it was getting irritating. She headed for the still room, wondering what had become of Lenora. The wolf had hardly left her side in the days since she'd been healed. It seemed as if Lenora had devoted herself to Arianna and was fiercely protective of her mistress. Just as the thought crossed her mind, the wolf slid out of the bushes lining the path, causing Arianna to jump just a little. For such a large animal, Lenora could certainly move with stealth when she chose. Entering the still room, Arianna took a seat at the small work table there. She left the door open slightly and saw Myron take up watch outside. She knew that he tried very hard to be unobtrusive, but still. Not for the first time, she wondered what her life would be like now if she'd never met Damuk. For certain, she wouldn't be followed by a watchdog. She sighed. That was an uncharitable thought. Myron was protecting her on Damuk's orders, and it was necessary. She had no right to be upset about it. That didn't mean she wouldn't be upset, just that she knew it was unfair. To her way of thinking, pregnant ladies were allowed to be unfair. She stopped to wonder if Damuk thought about her half as often as she thought about him. She hoped so. Cybil threw a gauntlet of wine into the rough stone wall while her son cringed from her wrath. She was furious with him, even after 3 weeks. She began pacing along the length of the chamber, resolutely ignoring her surroundings. Following their flight from Crown City, she had brought her son to this, a small stone hovel located at the apex of the mountains of Malara and the southern range. She'd had it constructed for her own use, for those magical works she could not perform in the city without her brother detecting her actions. The rough-hewn walls were ugly, there were no windows, and very little furniture. It wasn't a pleasant place, but it served her purposes. More to the point, no one knew it was here except for Cybil and Icon, and some slaves that belonged to her, heart and soul. None of them would betray her. "We are as safe from my dear brother as we're likely to get," she thought to herself. She spied Icon nearby, and that ignited her rage once again. She worked to suppress it as she took a seat on the only chair in the small room. The fact she'd had to rescue her son grated on her nerves. By rights, he should have been able to create a portal on his own and escape without involving her. It was a blow to her pride that her son wasn't nearly as powerful a mage as his damned cousin. "That's what I get for mating with a Republican," she thought scathingly. That thought didn't soothe her anger, for Damuk's mother had been a half-Republican slave, and yet he had inherited almost all of his father's strength. If she was half the mage her own brother was, better not to dwell on what could have been. It would only distract her from her purpose. Her mind returned to the events of the past months as she sat before the cold hearth. Her hatred for Damuk and the young slave he had taken to his bed was still very fresh and very strong. She wanted to kill the little brat, to see her suffer for all the carefully laid plans that were now in shambles, and all because of one pregnant slave girl. If she could just capture the bitch. More than anything, she desired to rule, both the Empire and the Republic. However, a woman would never be accepted as ruler of either nation. In both countries, the man ruled, the woman obeyed. The next best thing was to rule through her son, whom she had raised and shaped for the past 25 years. Someone who would bend eternally to her will. Cybil had first begun laying the foundation for her plans when Damuk was born 30 years ago. The goal was to have a son of her own, and then facilitate his rise to power. However, a child that would inherit the imperial throne wasn't good enough for her. She wanted a son who would rule over both nations, a puppet who would follow her directions. She wanted to be more than queen, more than empress. She wanted more than anyone had ever had before. She had left Crown City for a time, with her brother's blessing, though he hadn't known her plan or her destination. It hadn't been easy, but she'd managed to gain an acceptance at the Republican court. She was obviously too Eastern to pass as one of them, but that had been easily solved. She posed as the daughter of an imperial nobleman, casting out for voicing her opinion regarding the slaves and their treatment one too many times. Since the Republicans hated slavery, and Cybil was extremely persuasive, not to mention young and beautiful, the story had gained her the sympathy she'd been seeking. The courtiers, including King Cadfael himself, had been quick to accept her after that. Her beauty had immediately attracted the attention of the king, but getting him to marry her was another matter entirely. She'd been 18, and even though she'd hardly been a virgin when they'd arrived, she'd been very careful to appear the ever-virtuous maid. She made it very plain that he was getting nothing from her without an offer of marriage, though he'd certainly tried. It would have been quicker to use magic to attract Cadfael, but he had his own mages who would have detected her tampering with their king in short order. So she'd been forced to use her not inconsiderable feminine wiles to catch him in her net. She'd known it would work, but it would take longer than the use of magic. It had worked. He'd offered her marriage over the objections of the Senate. Their marriage had been a hasty affair, since Cadfael had been eager to bed her. She had been just as eager, but for different reasons. He may have been enamored with her body, but her only interest in him was his bloodline. Cybil had used a combination of herbs and magic to ensure she conceived quickly. Since she hadn't been using her magic directly on the king, his mages hadn't noticed. 6 months after marriage, knowing for certain that she was pregnant, she'd managed to fake her death. This hadn't been very difficult, since she was a mage, and more talented than anyone the Republican court could boast. She had been mildly annoyed when Cadfael had remarried and had another son, but it didn't really factor into her plans. Icon was the elder son, and conceived within the bonds of wedlock. He was the legal heir to the throne, and his claim would not be denied. She even had a plan for him to take the imperial throne. She'd originally tried to kill her brother and his son, but they had managed to completely avoid her traps with practiced ease. So she'd come up with another idea, one that would get her what she wanted without having to go to the trouble of killing them. Both Rocken and Damuk had a very intense sense of duty to the Empire. What they saw as a strength was really a weakness, and Cybil intended to use that against them. Exploiting weaknesses was her speciality. She'd summoned the muradeen 10 years ago to keep any Imperial forces from landing on Republican soil. If they had, it wouldn't have been long before they obtained the crystal and ended the one advantage the Republicans had. And that would put an end to all her schemes, at least the Imperial ones. Icon would still be heir in the Republic, but she would have no advantage over Rocken and Damuk. Her plan was simple. She would obtain the crystal that held the waters of the desert and use it as blackmail. A simple enough task. All she had to do was return to Scytha with her son and claim that she'd been abducted 25 years ago by Imperial mages. That would make Cadfael furious, and he'd feel guilty that he hadn't looked for her all those years ago. He'd do anything for her and her son at that point, even hand over the crystal he held so dear, especially if he thought that doing so would help him win this war. This she was counting on. She'd then offer the crystal to her brother, but with a price. In order to save his people, Rocken would abdicate the throne and Damuk would relinquish his claim. Both men would have to do this publicly and legally. She would ensure that she had the paperwork to back up her son's claim, and that the entire court knew that it had been done willingly. That left Icon the legal heir. At least that had been the plan until Damuk had returned from the Republic with his little slut. She knew Damuk too well, despite how little time she'd actually spent around him. He might give up all designs he had on the throne for himself to save his people, but now that he was to have a son, he would be determined to preserve the birthright of his unborn child. His duty would be to the child, not to his people. It was in her nephew's nature to think of family first. It was an annoying product of the close bond he had with his father, and not something that she could immediately rectify. If it hadn't been for the midwife, Valine, the unborn child would be dead by now. Cybil had tried unsuccessfully to poison Arianna. She'd then tried to kidnap the girl, but Icon had failed in that as well. Her son had always been a failure. The girl and her unborn child were still alive, and Damuk was determined to protect both. Now it would be almost impossible to place her own son on the Imperial throne. Almost. Another idea was occurring to her. Did it really matter if it was Icon who sat on both thrones? She controlled him. He'd do anything she asked. Why then could she not also control another? She could have both thrones, but through two different men. An evil smile lit her face. Icon could have the Republican throne since it was his by right. But for the Imperial, she would take Arianna, but this time she would handle it herself. There would be no mistakes. Once she had the girl and the crystal, she would bargain with her dear brother and his son. They would both relinquish any claim they had to the throne, and in exchange she would give Rocken the Sirius stone and allow him to release the waters held in the crystal. She would also agree to permit Arianna's child to live. She might even agree to return Arianna to her lover once the baby was born. But the baby, the rightful heir to the Imperial throne, she would demand that Damuk appoint her the guardian of the child. She'd raise the boy, mold him in her image, as she had done with Icon. She would have power through her grandnephew in the Empire, and through her son in the Republic. And finally, she would have everything she had desired. Cybil rose from the single chair. She looked towards Icon, who was still cowering from her. "Get up, my son," she said silkily. "Surely you wish to meet your father for the first time." Icon rose carefully. "We go now?" he asked, uncertain of his mother's mood. Cybil laughed. "Not immediately. There are plans to make. but we mustn't keep your father waiting too long. You will wish to meet his eldest son." She studied several of the magical items on the single table, most of them covered with old blood. "We'll have to use a portal to get near Cybil. It's too far to ride, and I don't relish traversing the ice shelf anyway." She smiled at her son. "Bring me a sacrifice. Any peasant will suit my purposes, though I prefer a young virgin if you can manage it. There is much to do, and not much time." Icon took himself off to do as directed. His mother's evil laugh followed him out into the fading light. And that's our tale from L.A. Quill today. If you enjoyed this chapter, let me know your favorite moment in the comments. Until next time, may your stories always be magical.